A millionaire businessman invests in his close friend's failed company, believing he can save the business and strengthen their friendship. During an audit, he discovers irregularities and a past environmental crime that had been covered up. Community, media, and former allies' pressure expose secrets that put his reputation at risk. Now he must decide whether to reveal the truth and break ties, or protect the friendship and bear the weight of guilt. Richard Thompson gazed at the city of Chicago through the immense windows of his office on the 20th floor. The orange hues of the late afternoon sky painted the skyscrapers with golden tones, creating a landscape that contrasted with the unease in his chest. On his black marble desk, his smartphone blinked insistently with a message he had just received. "I need your help, Richard. It's urgent. Michael." Michael Johnson had been his best friend throughout their childhood and adolescence in Springfield. They had shared dreams, secrets, and plans for the future. Time and circumstances had pulled them apart, but Michael's name still carried the weight of 2 decades of genuine friendship. "Mr. Thompson, your next meeting starts in 5 minutes, announced Sophia, his assistant, through the intercom. "Cancel all my afternoon appointments," Richard replied without taking his eyes off the city. "Something important has come up." 15 minutes later, Michael entered his office. Time had not been kind to him. Deep dark circles marked his face, and his prematurely graying hair betrayed the weight of his worries. His suit, though of good quality, looked slightly rumpled, as if he had slept in it. "Richard, I'm sorry to show up like this," Michael began, his voice betraying his nervousness. "I know it's been years since we last spoke, but—" "Sit down, Michael," Richard interrupted, gesturing to the leather armchair. "Would you like some coffee?" As Sophia served 2 cups of premium Colombian coffee, Richard studied his old friend. Something was clearly wrong. Michael, who had always been the epitome of composure and elegance, could barely hold the cup without his hands trembling. "It's Texton," Michael finally said, referring to his textile factory in Springfield. "We're on the brink of collapse. 300 families depend on that factory, Richard. People who have worked with us for generations." Richard knew Texton. It was one of the largest employers in the region, a family business passed down from father to son for 3 generations. In recent years, he had heard rumors about financial difficulties, but nothing that suggested such a dire situation. "Are the numbers really that bad?" asked Richard, leaning forward. "Terrible. The previous management, there were misguided decisions, poorly planned investments, unfavorable contracts." Michael ran his hand through his graying hair. "I tried everything, Richard. Banks, investors, renegotiations with suppliers. No one wants to take the risk." Richard stood up and walked to the window again. His reflection in the glass showed a 45-year-old man, meticulously cut black hair, an impeccable Italian suit. He was known in the market as the Restorer, a specialist in reviving companies in critical condition. His last success had been turning a supermarket chain on the brink of bankruptcy into one of the most profitable in the country. "Why now, Michael? Why after so long?" "Because you're the only one who can save Texton," replied Michael, his voice choked. "And because, despite the years, you're still the friend who explored every corner of that factory with me when we were kids." Memories flooded Richard's mind. Entire afternoons exploring the Texton warehouses, watching the looms in operation, dreaming of the day they themselves would run big companies. Michael's father let them play there, as long as they didn't disrupt production. "How much do you need?" asked Richard after a long silence. "20 million, replied Michael, almost in a whisper. "To start." Richard sat back down, drumming his fingers on the table. It was a considerable amount, even by his standards. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about loyalty, about honoring a friendship that, though dormant over time, still meant something. "I'll need majority control," Richard finally said, "and a full audit before any transfer." Michael's face lit up with a mix of relief and gratitude. Of course, anything you need." "And Michael," Richard stared intently at his friend, "I need to know if there's anything else I should be aware of, anything at all." "There's nothing," Michael replied quickly. Too quickly, Richard thought. "It's just a traditional company that needs a new direction." When Michael left the office, Richard remained seated, deep in thought. Sophia entered quietly to collect the coffee cups. "Sophia, I've cancelled my meetings for the next few weeks and prepare the documentation for a potential acquisition. We're going to visit Springfield." As night fell over Chicago, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to dive into much deeper waters than he had anticipated. But there was something in Michael's desperate gaze that kept him from backing out. Some loyalties, he reflected, are too strong to ignore even after so many years. Texton was no longer the factory Richard remembered from his childhood. The massive iron gate, once imposing and well-maintained, now showed clear signs of rust. The entrance garden, which used to be the pride of Michael's mother, was poorly kept with small patches of weeds growing among the withered flowers. "Welcome back," Michael said, trying to sound upbeat as he guided Richard through the nearly empty parking lot. "We've made some changes to the production line since the last time you were here." Richard observed everything with analytical eyes. His footsteps echoed through the administration hallways, where employees cast curious glances in his direction. The tension was palpable in the air, as if everyone knew their future depended on the decisions that would be made in the coming days. "I want to start with the financial area," Richard declared, adjusting the leather briefcase under his arm. "And then I need to see the production in action." Helen Smith, the company's controller for over 2 decades, was waiting for them in her office. She was a middle-aged woman, her brown hair pulled back into a severe bun, and thin-framed glasses that couldn't hide her nervousness. "Mr. Thompson, it's an honor to have you here," she said, extending her hand. "I've prepared all the reports your team requested." Over the next 3 hours, Richard immersed himself in spreadsheets, reports, and financial statements. His sharp training quickly identified some concerning points: fluctuating operational expenses without clear justification, supplier contracts with above-market values, and a series of small expenses categorized as miscellaneous costs that, when added up, represented a significant amount. "Helen, can you explain these variations in raw material costs?" Richard asked, pointing to a T-specific spreadsheet. The controller adjusted her glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, we had to make some emergency adjustments in recent months. Some traditional suppliers raised their prices significantly, so we sought alternatives. Without a formal bidding process?" "The circumstances were delicate," Michael interjected quickly. "We needed to keep production running." Richard made some notes in his black leather notebook, his face betraying no emotion. Years of experience had taught him that initial explanations rarely contained the full story. After the financial meeting, Michael took him on a tour of the production area. The noise of the looms was deafening, but to Richard it was almost musical. It reminded him of the afternoons of his childhood. The employees worked diligently, but he noticed that some equipment seemed to be operating below its optimal capacity. "That's the new eco-friendly fabric line," Michael explained, pointing to a specific section of the factory. "We invested heavily in it last year. It's the future of the market." Richard approached one of the machines, observing the process. "Who's the supplier of the sustainable raw material?" "A company called Green Fiber," Michael replied. "They're new to the market, but have excellent references." During lunch in the factory cafeteria, Richard observed Michael's interactions with the employees. There was respect there, but also apprehension. An elderly woman serving lunch, Mrs. Zilda, recognized Richard immediately. "Little Richard, how you've grown," she exclaimed, her eyes shining. "I still remember you and little Michael running around here causing mischief." Richard smiled, genuinely touched by the memory. "You haven't changed a bit, Mrs. Zilda." "But Texton has changed," she said, lowering her voice. "Changed a lot." Before she could continue, another employee called her attention and she walked away, leaving those words hanging in the air like a warning. At the end of the day, in his room at the best hotel in town, Richard organized his notes. Something didn't add up. The financial inconsistencies, though concerning, seemed like symptoms of a larger problem. His instinct, sharpened by years of dissecting companies in crisis, told him there was more to uncover. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter, Laura. "Dad, you won't believe it. I ran into Peter, Uncle Michael's son, at a party here in Chicago. What a coincidence. He told me you're helping out at Texton. We're planning to have dinner tomorrow. Kisses." Richard stared at the message for a long time. Peter, Michael's son, was studying business in Chicago, information Michael had forgotten to mention all day. It was yet another small piece that didn't fit into the puzzle he was starting to assemble. Standing up, Richard walked over to the hotel window, gazing at the city he once knew so well. The lights of Texton glimmered in the distance, one of the few buildings still lit at that hour. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start digging deeper. There were too many unanswered questions, and he needed to uncover the truth before committing his reputation and money to this venture. What was Michael not telling him? Why so many small inconsistencies? And why the growing feeling that he was only scratching the surface of something much bigger? The Bella Napoli restaurant was one of the most traditional in Chicago, known both for its excellent Italian cuisine and the discretion with which it treated its clients. Laura Thompson waited at a table near the window, occasionally checking her reflection in the wall mirror. At 23, she had inherited her father's elegant posture and her mother's captivating smile, a combination that, along with her sharp intelligence, made her a remarkable young woman. Peter Johnson entered the restaurant promptly at 8 p.m. Tall like Michael, but with a more laid-back and modern air, he smiled as he spotted Laura. They had known each other since childhood, but the years apart had turned their childhood games into a mutual attraction that neither of them could or wanted to hide. "You look beautiful," he said, sitting down. "It feels like just yesterday we were having water fights in the pool at the country house." Laura laughed, recalling those carefree summers. "And you always made a scene when you lost. Some things never change, do they?" The dinner flowed naturally, accompanied by wine and shared memories. But when the conversation turned to current business matters, Peter visibly tensed up. "How's your father?" Laura asked, noticing the change in his expression. "Mine is in Springfield at Texton." "I know," Peter replied, playing with his wine glass. "Dad is hopeful about the partnership, but I have to admit, I've been worried about him lately." "Why?" "He's changed a lot over the past few years, Laura. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and find him in the office, shuffling through papers, talking to himself. Something is eating him up inside." Meanwhile, in Springfield, Richard Thompson couldn't sleep. After tossing and turning in his hotel bed for hours, he decided to make a late-night visit to the factory. As the new majority partner, he had full access to the facilities. The night watchman, surprised by his presence, didn't hesitate to open the gates. Richard headed straight to the archives, located in the basement of the administrative building. If there were answers to his questions, that's where he would start. Under the fluorescent light, he examined dozens of dusty folders. Most contained trivial documents, old payroll sheets, expired contracts, unimportant correspondence. But one folder in particular caught his attention. It was hidden behind several boxes and had a faded label: Green Margin Project, Confidential. Inside, he found technical reports about an environmental preservation area near the factory. The dates were from 5 years ago, and several sections were highlighted in red. Attached was a legal opinion recommending maximum discretion in handling the matter. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Laura. "Dad, I just had dinner with Peter. Something strange is going on. He's really worried about Uncle Michael. He said he's been acting different, obsessive. I think we should talk." Richard took photos of some documents with his phone and continued his search. In a locked drawer, which he managed to open with a trick he learned from years of auditing, he found an external hard drive. He pocketed it, intending to examine it later. The next morning, during a meeting with the quality department, Richard noticed something peculiar in the recent production reports. Green Fiber, the supplier of eco-friendly materials, had environmental certifications with sequential registration numbers, something extremely unlikely for documents issued on different dates. "Sandra," he called the quality supervisor, "who is your contact at Green Fiber?" "Actually, Mr. Thompson, all contact is made through Mr. Johnson," she replied hesitantly. "I've never met anyone from the company in person." During lunch, Richard received an unexpected call from an unknown number. It was Charles Miller, a former employee of Texton's finance department. "Mr. Thompson, I heard you've taken over part of the company," Charles said, his voice low and nervous. "We need to talk, but not at the factory. There are things you need to know." They arranged to meet that night at a gas station on the highway. Richard hung up thoughtfully, watching the factory activity through the window of his temporary office. He saw Michael talking to an unfamiliar man in the parking lot. The conversation seemed tense, and Michael was gesturing agitatedly. That afternoon, while reviewing recent contracts, Richard received another phone call, this time from an investment bank in Chicago. They wanted to confirm an alleged securities transaction involving Texton, something that wasn't mentioned in any official documents he had reviewed. The day ended with more questions than answers. In his hotel room, Richard connected the hard drive he had found in the archive to his laptop. Most of the files were corrupted, but a folder named Environmental Compensation was still accessible. Inside, he found something that made his stomach churn: spreadsheets detailing payments to an environmental consulting firm that, according to a quick internet search, had closed 3 years ago. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Laura. "Dad, Peter told me more things. He said he found strange documents in Uncle Michael's office at home. He mentioned something about a preservation area. I'm worried. Can we meet when you get back?" Richard looked out the hotel window, watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, Charles Miller was waiting for him with more revelations. His childhood friend seemed more like a stranger by the day, and his daughter was getting emotionally involved with Charles's son. The lines between personal and professional were beginning to blur, and Richard feared he was only starting to uncover the true scale of the mess he had gotten himself into. The night was particularly dark when Richard parked his car at the highway gas station. The place, lit only by the fluorescent lights of the convenience store, was practically deserted at that hour. He checked his watch, 11:15 p.m. Charles Miller had insisted on this late hour, claiming he needed to make sure he wouldn't be seen. A silver Gol, visibly worn out, pulled into the station and parked a few spaces ahead. Charles stepped out of the vehicle, looking around nervously. He was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and jeans, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He approached Richard's car and quickly got into the passenger seat. "Sorry for the late hour, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice trembling. "But I couldn't risk being seen in town. Springfield can be too small sometimes." Richard studied the former employee carefully. "What's so important that it couldn't wait until tomorrow, Charles?" "Green fiber," he began, wiping his sweaty face. "It's a shell company. There's no factory, no production. It's just a tax ID and a virtual office in Chicago." Richard kept his expression neutral, but his heart raced. "Go on." "I worked in finance, processing payments. At first I didn't notice anything strange, but then I started noticing the amounts, the dates. They were always round transfers, without detailed invoices. When I questioned it, they told me it was a special confidential agreement." Charles pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Here are copies of all the transfers from the last 2 years. There's more. The Environmental Preservation Department. There was a deal, Mr. Thompson. A deal to hide something very serious." Before he could continue, bright headlights illuminated the car. A black SUV had pulled into the gas station and parked near them. Charles shrank in his seat. "I need to go," he said, grabbing the door handle. "He's here. I can't be seen." "Who's here, Charles? What are you talking about?" But Charles was already out, practically running to his car. The black SUV started up and slowly left the gas station. Richard watched in the rearview mirror as the two vehicles disappeared into the darkness of the highway, heading in opposite directions. The next day, Richard arrived early at the factory. His first destination was the quality control laboratory, where the fabrics from the eco-friendly line were tested. "Good morning, Dr. Paul," greeted the responsible chemist. "Can you show me the latest analysis reports for the green fiber materials?" The scientist, an elderly man with white hair who had worked at Texton for over 30 years, hesitated for a moment. "Of course, Mr. Thompson, but are you sure you want to see this now?" The reports were impeccably organized, but something caught Richard's attention. The tested samples showed inconsistent chemical compositions for materials supposedly from the same source. "Dr. Paul, is this normal?" The chemist adjusted his glasses, visibly uncomfortable. "Actually, sir, I've been trying to alert the board for months. These materials were not what they claimed to be. And there's more." He lowered his voice. "We found traces of substances that shouldn't be present in sustainable fabrics." At that moment, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Laura with a photo, her and Peter at a cafe in Chicago, smiling. "Dad, we need to talk. Peter told me some things about green fiber that you need to know." Richard barely had time to process the message when Michael burst into the laboratory. "Richard, what a surprise to find you here," he exclaimed, forcing a smile. "I thought you'd be in the meeting with the suppliers." "I changed my plans," replied Richard, discreetly putting away his phone. "Dr. Paul was showing me some interesting results." Michael's face hardened almost imperceptibly. "Paul, could you give us a moment? I need to speak with Richard privately." As soon as they were alone, Michael closed the laboratory door. "Richard, we've been friends for decades. Trust me when I say some things are better left as they are." "Like what, Michael?" "Like green fiber." A heavy silence fell between them. Through the laboratory window, Richard watched a group of employees arriving for the morning shift. Honest people, dedicated workers who had no idea of the shadows looming over their jobs. "You don't understand," Michael finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "There are bigger things at play here. Powerful people. It's not as simple as it seems. Is that why Charles Miller is so scared?" The mention of the name made Michael pale. "You spoke to Charles?" Before Richard could answer, his phone vibrated again. It was a notification from a local newspaper. "Car accident on Highway SP 330. Driver missing." The photo showed a destroyed silver Goal on the side of the road. Richard's blood ran cold. He looked at Michael, who stood motionless in front of him, and for the first time in 40 years of friendship, he saw a stranger. The breakfast at the Grand Hotel remained untouched on the table as Richard analyzed the flash drive Charles had given him the night before. Every file opened revealed a new layer of the scheme: overpriced invoices, contracts with dubious clauses, and an intricate network of seemingly independent companies that, upon closer inspection, pointed to the same addresses and people. Your phone rang. It was Helen Smith, the controller. "Mr. Thompson," her voice sounded tense, "something happened. Dr. Paul requested an immediate shutdown of the company. He left a resignation letter on my desk this morning." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the news. The chemist, who just yesterday had expressed concern about the material analyses, had simply vanished. First Charles, now Paul. The pattern was impossible to ignore. "Helen, I need you to do something for me," he said after a moment of reflection. "I want all records of payments made to environmental consultancies over the last 5 years. And don't mention this to anyone, especially Michael." In Chicago, Laura was walking through the halls of the law school where she was in her final year when she received a message from Peter. "I need to see you urgently. I found something in my father's office. It's about the preservation area." They met an hour later in the Central Library, a place public enough for them to talk without drawing attention. Peter seemed agitated, his hands trembling slightly as he held a brown folder. "What did you find?" asked Laura, concerned about her friend's state. "Documents about a preservation area near the factory," he replied, lowering his voice. "Apparently there was a serious issue a few years ago. Something related to soil contamination, but the strangest part is the payments. Huge amounts to an environmental consultancy that, from what I've researched, never actually existed." Laura felt her heart race. "Peter, I need to tell my father." "I know," he replied, running his hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. "But there's more. I found emails. My father isn't alone in this. Big players are involved, Laura. Dangerous people." Back in Springfield, Richard decided to make an unplanned visit to the preservation area mentioned in the documents. The site was about 20 minutes from the factory, a considerable stretch of land that, according to official records, should have been under environmental protection. Upon arrival, he immediately noticed something strange. There were no signs identifying the protected area, no fences or proper markings. A dirt path led to a clearing where he found traces of recent activity, tire tracks, and some empty drums, partially hidden by the vegetation. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Sophia, his assistant in Chicago. "Boss, the research on green fiber has brought concerning results. The registered address is for an abandoned building, and there's more. The same tax ID appears for 3 other companies, all registered in the last 5 years. While photographing the abandoned drums, Richard heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. He quickly hid behind some trees and watched as a truck entered the clearing. 2 men got out and began loading the empty drums. "We need to clean everything. Up by tomorrow," one of them said. "The inspection team is going to make a surprise visit to the factory." Richard recorded the conversation on his phone, his heart pounding in his chest. How did they know about a surprise inspection? Back at the hotel, he found an envelope with no sender at his door. Inside was just an old photo, him and Michael as teenagers, smiling in front of Texton. On the back, a handwritten message. "Some friendships are worth more than the truth." His phone rang again. It was Laura. "Dad," her voice trembled. "Peter showed me some documents. It's worse than we thought. There are politicians involved, big names, and Dad, we found records of strange payments, huge amounts to companies that seem to not even exist." Richard sat heavily on the hotel bed, the old photo still in his hands. In a few hours, he would have a decisive meeting with Texton's board of directors. Michael would certainly be there, as well as representatives from the major shareholders. The choice before him was clear and painful. He could pretend he hadn't seen anything, protect a decades-long friendship, and preserve hundreds of jobs, or move forward with the investigation, knowing the outcome could destroy not only Texton, but also lives and relationships built over generations. His phone vibrated once more, a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Paul's wife. He left something for you before he left. He said it's about the material tests. Please, we need to meet." The Central Cafe was a modest establishment in the old center of Springfield, frequented mainly by retirees and public servants. Richard chose a table in the back, from where he could observe both the entrance and the street activity. It was 7:30 in the morning, and in a few hours he would face the Texton board meeting. Mary Augusta, Dr. Paul's wife, arrived promptly. She was a distinguished-looking woman with neatly styled gray hair and a demeanor that carried equal measures of concern and dignity. "My husband was always an upright man, Mr. Thompson," she began after ordering a coffee. "In 30 years at Texton, he never brought work home, until 3 months ago." She opened her purse and pulled out a hardcover notebook, the kind used in laboratories. Paul started taking detailed notes on all the analyses. He said it was for his own safety. "Last night before he left, he asked me to give this to you." Richard carefully flipped through the notebook. It was page after page of meticulous notes, test results, observations about anomalies in the samples, and most importantly, a series of printed emails pasted onto the last few pages. "There's one more thing," said Mary Augusta, her voice trembling slightly. "Paul had a visitor the day before yesterday, a very elegant man, driving a black SUV. He offered my husband an early retirement. The amount was indecent." Richard felt a chill as he remembered the black SUV at the gas station the night he met Charles. "Where is Dr. Paul now?" "Safe and sound," she replied firmly. "With our daughter in Portugal. She left last night." While driving to Texton, Richard received constant messages from Laura. "Dad, Peter is very nervous. He said he found more documents, something about an offshore account. I just found out that Uncle Michael cancelled all his meetings today, except for the board meeting. Peter thinks they're trying to cover their tracks. We need to act fast." The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. As he entered the meeting room on the top floor of Texton, Richard immediately noticed that something was different. In addition to the usual board members and Michael, there was a new face. Anthony Vasquez, a well-known Portuguese businessman with investments in various industries in the region. "Richard, glad you could make it," said Michael with forced cordiality. "Do you know Mr. Vasquez? He has a very interesting proposal for Texton." Anthony Vasquez smiled calculatedly. "Mr. Thompson, your reputation precedes you. We are proposing a merger with our group. We would take over full management, including all of the company's current responsibilities. Richard scanned the room. Helen Smith was present, sitting in a corner, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. Michael avoided his gaze, focused on some papers in front of him. "What about green fiber?" Richard asked directly. "Is it part of the deal?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Anthony Vasquez maintained his smile, but his eyes hardened. All existing contracts would be re-evaluated, naturally, including the contracts with the Phantom Environmental Consultancy. Michael stood up abruptly. "Richard, can we talk in private?" "No, Michael, no more private conversations. I have here." He opened his briefcase, pulling out Dr. Paul's notebook. "Evidence of systematic tampering with test results. I have records of irregular payments, and I have proof of deliberate environmental contamination." Anthony Vasquez stood up calmly. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you are not considering the full picture. This merger proposal represents the only viable way out for Texton. Without it, 300 families will lose their jobs. Your own reputation could be compromised." At that moment, Richard's phone vibrated with a new message from Laura. "Dad, Peter just showed me something shocking. Green fiber is linked to the Vasquez group. They've been behind everything from the start." Richard looked at Michael, his childhood friend, the man with whom he had shared dreams and ideals. He now saw in him not only desperation, but also guilt and fear. "Gentlemen," Richard said, standing up, "this meeting is over. In 1 hour, I will be sending a detailed report to the relevant authorities." "You wouldn't do that," whispered Michael. "Think of our friendship. Think of the jobs." "That's exactly why I'm doing it," Richard replied. "Because there is still something in our friendship worth saving. And because these workers deserve a clean company, not a front for illegal activities." As he left the room, Richard Thompson overheard Anthony Vasquez on the phone, speaking quickly in European Portuguese. In the hallway, Helen Smith caught up to him, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she said, handing him a flash drive. "Here it is, all the records I've hidden all these years. I can't carry this weight anymore." The news of the interrupted meeting spread quickly through the halls of Texton. Richard, locked in his temporary office, analyzed the contents of the flash drive provided by Helen, while dozens of unread messages piled up on his phone. Outside, he could hear the growing murmur of employees, worried about the rumors starting to circulate. Laura called, her voice filled with concern. "Dad, Peter is desperate. He just told me that Uncle Michael is having a nervous breakdown at home. Aunt Beatrice called asking for help." "Laura, stay where you are," Richard replied, massaging his temples. "The situation here is delicate. I don't want you involved in this right now." "Too late, Dad." Peter found documents proving that the Vasquez group has tried this before with other companies. They have a pattern. They buy struggling companies, use them for illegal operations, and then abandon them, leaving a trail of environmental issues and layoffs. Richard opened another file from Helen's flash drive and felt his stomach churn. It was a detailed report on the true extent of contamination in the preservation area. The document included photos, soil analyses, and, most alarmingly, studies on the health impact on the local community that had been deliberately suppressed. His phone rang. It was Sophia, his assistant in Chicago. "Boss, there's some strange activity here. I just got a call from the Vasquez office trying to schedule a press conference for tomorrow. They're going to announce the purchase of Texton." As a done deal. Before he could respond, Helen rushed into his office without knocking. "Mr. Thompson, they're destroying documents in the archive. I just saw 2 of Vasquez's employees taking boxes to the disposal area." Richard stood up immediately. "Helen, call security. No one leaves the building with any documents." In the hallway, he ran into Mrs. Zilda, the former cafeteria employee, who discreetly pulled him aside. "Richard, my boy," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I've kept this with me for years. I never thought I'd have the courage to show it." She pulled an old phone from her uniform pocket. "I recorded a conversation 5 years ago when all this started. Mr. Michael with that Portuguese guy planning how they would use the factory. In the Texton parking lot, Richard watched 2 security guards blocking a car loaded with document boxes from leaving. Anthony Vasquez was arguing heatedly on the phone in European Portuguese, gesturing nervously. His phone buzzed with a message. From an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, this is Joaquim from the night shift reception. You need to see the security camera footage from the last month. Something's happening in the production area late at night." In Chicago, Laura was facing her own dilemma. Peter had arrived at her apartment distraught with a suitcase. "My dad's lost it, Laura," he said, collapsing on the couch. "He's burning papers at home, yelling on the phone. I've never seen him like this. And there's more. I found this in his office." Peter showed her an old laptop. "There are emails here from years ago. Vasquez had his eye on Texton long before the financial problems surfaced. They created the crisis, Laura. It was all planned." Laura felt her heart tighten. "Peter, I need to tell my father." "I know," he replied, running his hands over his tired face. "That's why I brought this to you. But Laura, this is going to destroy my father." Back at Texton, Richard received another important call, this time from an old contact in the industrial sector. "Richard, be careful with Vasquez. I just found out he's involved in a much bigger scheme. Texton isn't the first and won't be the last. They have powerful connections, big players behind them." As he processed all this information, Richard saw Michael crossing the parking lot, walking toward him. His old friend seemed to have aged 10 years in just a few hours. His eyes were red and his hands were visibly shaking. "We need to talk, Richard," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not here. At our old cabin on my father's property, like the old days." Richard studied his friend's face. Behind the despair, he caught a glimpse of the boy he grew up with, the one he shared dreams and secrets with in that very cabin. "All right, Michael, but this time I want the whole truth." His phone vibrated again, another message from Laura. "Dad, I'm heading to Springfield with Peter. He has important evidence, and Dad, he's willing to testify against his own father to do the right thing." The old cabin remained almost unchanged from Richard's childhood memories. Built by Michael's father in the 70s, the simple wooden structure had been a silent witness to countless conversations, dreams, and promises between the two friends. Now, in the twilight of a 4-decade-long friendship, its rustic walls would hold yet another decisive conversation. Michael lit the gas lantern. The cabin had never had electricity, part of its charm according to old Mr. Johnson. The yellowish light cast dancing shadows on the walls, where the old framed photographs could still be seen. The two friends fishing, swimming in the reservoir, dreaming about the future. "Remember when we planned to revolutionize Texton?" Michael began, his voice heavy with nostalgia. "We had so many ideas." "What happened, Michael?" Richard asked, sitting on an old wooden bench. "How did we get to this point?" Michael took a deep breath, pouring himself a glass of water from the clay jug, another item that had survived the passage of time. "It started 6 years ago. Texton was doing well, solid. Then I got a visit from Vasquez. He knew everything. About us, about the company, about my family. He said he had a special project." Richard listened intently, watching his friend's expressions through the flickering shadows. At first it seemed like a dream. He offered cutting-edge technology, international contracts, expansion. Green fiber would be our gateway to the European market. But then, Michael paused, his hands trembling as he held the glass. Then the demands started, small at first. A signature here, a modified document there. Before I knew it, I was completely entangled. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Shame, maybe, or fear. "They have photos, Richard. Fabricated evidence that ties me to everything. If I fell, I'd fall alone. At least that's what I thought." Richard's phone vibrated, a message from Laura. "Dad, we're on our way. Peter has the original files from Uncle Michael's computer, proof that he was being blackmailed from the start. Your son is with my daughter," Richard said. "He found documents." Michael closed his eyes, a sad smile on his lips. "Peter has always been braver than me, more principled, like you, Richard." Suddenly, headlights lit up the cabin window. A car was approaching on the dirt road. "They followed me," Michael whispered, standing up abruptly. "Vasquez has people everywhere. We need to—" "Dad! Uncle Michael!" Laura's voice called from outside. "It's us, Laura and Peter entered the cabin carrying a laptop and several folders. Peter ran to hug his father, who broke down in tears. "Forgive me, son," Michael sobbed. "Forgive me for putting this burden on you." "Uncle Michael," Laura interrupted, opening the laptop. "We found everything. Vasquez's emails, the threats, the original documents before they were tampered with. They set you up from the beginning." Richard watched the scene with a tightness in his chest. There in that cabin that had witnessed so many moments of his youth, 2 generations faced the consequences of difficult choices and tested loyalties. "There's more," Peter continued, his voice steady. "We found out that Vasquez did this to 5 other companies in Portugal. Same scheme, approach, promises, then blackmail and destruction. He's being investigated there, but he always manages to escape." Michael stood up, walking over to one of the photographs on the wall. It was of him and Richard at 15 years old, holding a science fair trophy. Their project on sustainability in the textile industry. "Richard," he said, turning to his friend, "I need you to know the whole truth. About the preservation area, about the contracts, about everything. Not for me, but for the 300 employees who trust Texton. And because," his voice faltered, "because I can't leave this legacy for my son." At that moment, more headlights lit up the cabin. This time, it was several cars. "It's them," said Peter, running to the window. "Vasquez and his goons, they must have followed us." Richard stood up, a clear decision in his eyes. "Michael, there's still time to do the right thing, but I need to know, are you with me on this?" His friend looked at his son, then at the photo on the wall, and finally at Richard. In the shadows of the cabin that held so many memories of their youth, Michael Johnson made his choice. The sound of cars parking broke the night's silence. Through the cracks in the cabin, they could see 3 black SUVs and several men in suits strategically positioning themselves around the structure. Anthony Vasquez stepped out of the last vehicle, his impeccable Italian suit contrasting with the rustic surroundings. "Michael," his authoritative voice cut through the night, "we need to talk like civilized people." Inside the cabin, Richard quickly organized a plan. "Laura, Peter, copy all the files to my flash drive. Michael, now's the time. You have a choice to make." Michael looked at his son, then at the old photograph on the wall, and finally faced Richard. "I've already made my choice." Heading toward the cabin door, he shouted, "Come in, Anthony." "Alone." Vasquez entered the cabin, his artificial smile barely masking the tension in his eyes. The atmosphere was heavy with history and confrontation, the past and the present converging in that decisive moment. "What a touching scene," he said, looking around. "A family reunion in the old cabin. But you know this won't change anything, right? I have all the necessary documents for the transfer of Texton. Everything is signed and registered." "Fake documents," Peter interrupted, his voice steady. "I have the originals here showing how you manipulated everything from the start." Vasquez laughed, but his eyes remained cold. "And who would believe you? I have connections everywhere that matters. The word of a respected businessman against a group of sentimentalists." "It's not just words," said Richard, grabbing his phone. Helen Smith handed over all the evidence of the irregular transactions. Dr. Paul documented every falsified test, and Mrs. Zilda has recordings of you from 5 years ago, planning all of this. Vasquez's mask of confidence began to falter. "Impossible. I made sure that you had eliminated all the evidence," Michael finished, taking a step forward. "You may have bought people, Anthony, but you didn't buy their consciences. Every employee you threatened held on to a piece of the truth, waiting for the right moment." Laura, who had just finished copying the files, added, "And there's more. I just sent all the documentation to my contacts at the newspaper. In a few minutes, everything will be in the hands of the press." "You don't understand." Vasquez ran his hand through his impeccably styled hair, his composure beginning to crumble. "This is bigger than you can imagine. There are powerful interests involved, people who don't tolerate failure." "Like the other companies you destroyed in Portugal?" Peter asked. "We found everything, Mr. Vasquez. Your pattern of operation, the shell companies, the forged documents. You're not as careful as you think." At that moment, the flashing lights of sirens began to illuminate the area around the cabin. Vasquez's men started to scatter, running to their cars. "This ends here," Richard said, his voice filled with determination. "Texton will survive, but it will survive clean." "You don't understand, Thompson." Vasquez tried one last move. "I can make you rich, richer than you ever dreamed. Just..." "Enough!" Michael's voice thundered through the cabin. "Enough manipulation, enough threats. I'm going to tell everything, Anthony. Every detail, every scheme, every threat. For my son, for the employees of Texton, and for the memory of my father who built this company with honesty." Vasquez took a step toward the door, but was stopped by Richard. "The authorities are already on their way. With all the evidence we've gathered, you'll have a lot to explain." Laura hugged Peter, who watched his father with a mix of pride and relief. Michael walked over to the old photograph on the wall, touching it gently. "You know, Anthony," he said, turning to Vasquez, "you never understood the true value of Texton. It's not about the contracts or the profits. It's the trust that 300 families have placed in us. It's the legacy my father built. And it's something that people like you, who only see numbers, will never understand." The sirens were closer now. Through the windows of the cabin, they could see vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Vasquez's empire of lies was about to crumble. And with it, a new chapter would begin for Texton. The next morning dawned with a different atmosphere at Texton. Employees arrived for another workday to find vehicles parked in front of the factory and a news crew setting up equipment in the parking lot. The buzz was intense, with groups forming in the hallways, sharing information and speculating about the events of the previous night. Richard observed everything from his temporary office, where he was conducting an urgent video conference with his team in Chicago. Sophia coordinated communication efforts while he organized the next steps. "We need an official statement by noon," he instructed. "Emphasize that production will continue as usual and that all jobs are secure. And schedule a general meeting with the employees for this afternoon." Helen Smith entered the room carrying a stack of documents. Her dark circles betrayed a sleepless night, but there was a different gleam in her eyes, something like relief. "Mr. Thompson, I've completed the review you requested. I've separated all the legitimate contracts from the fraudulent ones. And I found something interesting." She placed an old folder on the table. "These are Mr. Johnson's original plans," Michael's father, "for the sustainable modernization of the factory. Plans that were shelved when Vasquez showed up." In the cafeteria, Mrs. Zilda served coffee to the employees while sharing her perspective on the events. "I always knew that Richard would come back to fix things. He and Michael, since they were little, had a special love for this factory." Laura and Peter had spent the night organizing all the documentation with the help of a team of lawyers. Now, seated in Dr. Paul's old office at the laboratory, they were planning the next steps. "We need to implement a new quality control system," said Peter, his eyes shining with the same enthusiasm his grandfather had when talking about Texton. "Something transparent that any employee can understand and verify." "What about turning that preservation area into a model environmental recovery project?" suggested Laura, taking notes on her tablet. "It could be a symbol of the company's new chapter." Michael, who had spent hours giving testimony, entered the laboratory. He looked exhausted, but also lighter, as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Son," he called softly. Peter looked up from his papers. "I want you to take charge of the production line restructuring project. You've always understood the true spirit of this company better than I have." The young man stood up and hugged his father, while Laura discreetly wiped away a tear. In the factory yard, Richard was talking to a group of long-time employees, including several who had worked there since his father's time. He explained the changes that were coming, but mostly he listened to their stories and suggestions. "Texton has always been more than a factory," said Joseph, a weaver with 30 years at the company. "It's part of our family. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't have a voice to speak up. Now you do," replied Richard, "and we need that voice to rebuild everything the right way." His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Paul, straight from Portugal. "Congratulations on your courage. When things settle down, I'd like to return. We have a lot of work ahead." By late afternoon, all the employees had gathered in the main warehouse for an official announcement. Richard and Michael stepped onto the small makeshift stage together. In the background, an old photo of the two as teenagers had been enlarged and placed on a banner, along with the phrase, "Texton, renewing bonds, building the future." "Friends," began Michael, his voice trembling. "For years I allowed fear and greed to tarnish the legacy my father built. Today, thanks to the courage of our young ones," he looked at Peter and Laura, "and the loyalty of a true friend, we have a chance for a fresh start." Richard took the floor. "Texton has always been more than just a fabric factory. It's a family. That spans generations. In the coming months, we will implement significant changes. It will be difficult, requiring sacrifice and dedication, but this time we will do everything transparently together." As the employees applauded, Laura approached Peter, intertwining her fingers with his. "You know," she whispered, "our parents were right when they said this factory had magic." "Had?" he replied with a smile. "I think the magic is just beginning." 3 months had passed since that night at the cabin. Texton was breathing new life, quite literally. The old ventilation system had been completely overhauled, and the smell of chemicals had been replaced by a cleaner, more pleasant environment. It was just one of the many changes implemented under the new shared management between Richard and Peter. That particular morning, Dr. Paul, who had recently returned from Portugal, was leading a meeting in the renovated laboratory. The walls, once grey, now displayed colourful charts of quality control and environmental certifications, all legitimate. "As you can see," he explained to a group of independent auditors, "each production batch undergoes rigorous testing. The results are published in real time on our transparency portal, accessible to any employee or client." Laura, who had taken over the coordination of the company's legal department, was organizing a series of documents in her new office. The windows overlooked the preservation area, now in the process of recovery under the guidance of the country's top environmental experts. "The latest reports are promising," she commented to Helen Smith, who continued as controller, now with expanded oversight powers. "The soil regeneration is happening faster than we expected." In the production sector, Michael was closely supervising the installation of the new looms. He no longer held an executive position, a decision he made voluntarily, but his experience was invaluable in training the younger employees. "Look here," he said to a group of apprentices. "This is the same model of loom my father installed 40 years ago. Of course, it's all modernized now, but the principle is the same. Quality has no shortcuts." Richard watched the activity from his office, now decorated with old photos of the factory, including one of him and Michael at the science fair. His phone rang. It was Sophia from Chicago. "Boss, 3 more companies have expressed interest in partnerships with the new Texton, and the article about the company's transformation was published in the leading business magazine. Would you like me to send a copy?" "Later," he replied, his eyes fixed on a scene in the courtyard through the window. Peter and Laura were chatting animatedly with a group of college students, part of the company's new internship program. The couple had become the symbol of Texton's renewal. Peter, with his technical expertise and modern vision, revolutionized production processes. Laura, with her legal background and social sensitivity, ensured that every change respected not only the law, but also the ethical values that were now the company's foundation. Mrs. Zilder, who now coordinated a completely revamped cafeteria, smiled as she served coffee to the visitors. "You know," she said to the young interns, "I've worked here for 40 years and I've never seen Texton so alive." At the end of that afternoon, a small ceremony was held in the factory's auditorium. It was the inauguration of the Henry Miller Memorial, a space dedicated to the company's history, including recent events. It was decided that nothing would be hidden, as the challenges were also part of the journey. "My grandfather," Peter addressed the audience, "dreamed of a company that was more than just a business. He wanted to create something that would last generations, something that would make a difference in people's lives. For a while we lost sight of that path. But now we're back on track," Richard added, joining him on stage. "And with a valuable lesson: True success isn't measured just in numbers, but in the positive impact we make. Michael, seated in the front row, applauded with tears in his eyes. Beside him, Laura discreetly held an envelope, the preliminary results of another external audit, confirming that Texton was now a benchmark for sustainable practices in the textile industry. At the end of the day, as employees left the factory, Richard and Michael walked to the old cabin. The place had been preserved exactly as it was, now serving as a silent reminder that sometimes you need to return to your roots to find the way forward. "You know," Michael said, watching the sunset through the cabin window, "my father always said that a company is like a tree. It needs strong roots to grow tall." "And our roots have always been here," Richard replied, touching the old photo on the wall. "We just needed to remember that." Outside, the sound of the modernized looms blended with the songs of birds that had returned to inhabit the restored area. It was a new symphony, a sonic symbol of the transformation Texton had achieved. A year had passed since the changes at Texton. The factory, which once struggled to survive, now stood out as an example of transparent management and sustainability in the textile industry. The entrance garden, fully restored, proudly displayed the flowers Michael's mother had loved so much, now cared for by a group of employees who volunteered to keep this tradition alive. On that special spring morning, Texton was preparing for a significant event: the inauguration of the Sustainable Research and Development Center, a project envisioned by Peter and Laura, who were now engaged. The new building, constructed with eco-friendly technologies, occupied part of the previously degraded area, now transformed into an example of environmental recovery. "It's amazing how everything has changed," Helen Smith commented to Richard Thompson as they crossed the factory courtyard. "Remember when you first arrived here a year ago? Everything was so different." Richard smiled, watching the employees arriving for another day of work. The tension in the air, the fear of the future, was gone. Instead, he saw confident faces, people proud to be part of this story. Dr. Paul, now the director of the new research center, led a group of university students through the modernized laboratory. "Here we don't just develop new fabrics," he explained, "but also solutions to make the entire production chain more sustainable." In the boardroom, Michael Johnson was organizing some old documents. Though he no longer held an executive position, his experience was crucial on the company's advisory board. On his desk, a new photo sat beside an old one, him and Richard at the cabin, taken recently, a reminder that some friendships are too strong to be broken. "Mr. Johnson," Mrs. Zilda called from the doorway, "it's time. Everyone is gathering." In the auditorium. The large Texton auditorium was packed. Employees, local authorities, representatives from other companies in the industry, and journalists awaited the start of the ceremony. In the front row, Laura held Peter's hand, both nervous about their speeches. Richard took the stage first. "A year ago, when I returned to Texton, I found a company in crisis, but what I discovered here was much more than financial problems. Found people with a genuine love for this place and an immense desire to do the right thing." Michael joined him on stage. "Texton has always been more than a factory. My father used to say it was a dream woven with threads of trust and hard work. For a while we forgot that, but thanks to the courage of our young people," he smiled at Peter and Laura, "and the loyalty of a true friend, we've reclaimed our essence." Peter and Laura presented the new research center, explaining how it represented the future of the company: innovative, transparent, and committed to sustainability. The project included partnerships with universities and an incubation program for startups focused on eco-friendly solutions. After the ceremony, as guests toured the new facilities, Richard found a surprise in his office: a new painting, a gift from the employees. It was a montage with photos of Texton's transformation, from the difficult moments to the complete renewal. In the center, an old photo of him and Michael at the science fair with an inscription, "Because some dreams are too big to be forgotten." At the end of that day, Richard, Michael, Peter, and Laura gathered in the cabin. The place had been preserved, in its simplicity, but now served as a space for memory and reflection for the new generations of Texton. "You know," said Laura, watching the sunset through the cabin window, When it all started, I thought it was a story about saving a company, but it was so much more than that. It was about saving relationships, added Peter, embracing his fiancée. About honoring the past while building the future. Michael pulled an old project his father had designed for Texton out of his pocket. Look at this, he said, emotional. My father dreamed of a sustainable factory 40 years ago. We just needed to remember his values to find the way. Richard smiled, thinking about how the choices we make can change not only our lives, but the lives of hundreds of people. Texton was no longer just a textile factory. It was a symbol of transformation, of how it's possible to rebuild something better on solid foundations of ethics and transparency. And to think it all started here, he said, touching the wooden walls of the cabin, in this place where two boys dreamed of changing the world. And we did, replied Michael, smiling, maybe not in the way we imagined, but we did. Outside, the sun set over Texton, painting the sky with shades of hope. The modern looms continued their rhythmic work, weaving not just threads, but also the future of a company that learned that true success is built with honesty, courage, and above all, the transformative power of genuine relationships.